Thank you, Lascan Corley. I want to start by thanking all of the contributors to this debate. I have to say, though, I was somewhat amused by the similarity of scripts between Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. It was the single transferable script, and you do come from the same background and hold the same kind of ideology. And there isn't a cigarette paper between you. And the other point I would make to Deputy Hayden there, Deputy Hayden should know that we were required to have our private member's motion in last Wednesday. So it wasn't a question of looking for publicity ahead of the thing. We were required to have it in last Wednesday, and we did that. The other point I would make is that I have to say I am somewhat concerned, and I wonder about Minister Murphy's memory. Because I heard you this morning, Minister Murphy, on Morning Ireland, where you had a right swipe at me, and you referred to hypocrisy. And you said that our party never put down any amendments on the rent reform bill earlier this year. Now, what's wrong with your memory, Minister? Because in January 2018, it was the Social Democrats that introduced the Residential Tenancies Bill. At that stage, you thanked Deputy Murphy and myself for bringing the bill forward. You acknowledged the substance of the bill and its genuine motivation to improve the situation for tenants at a time of undersupply in the residential sector. So, do you not remember that, Minister? And you undertook to bring in legislation to do what our bill was doing. And we had to wait a year for you to do that, because it was a full year before you brought in the government bill to do what we had proposed a year earlier. And, Minister, you said we didn't propose any amendments. Do you not remember us having a conversation across the Housing Committee floor about how we might improve your legislation? Do you not remember that, Minister? And do you not remember that when your bill was brought to the floor of this House, several of us signed a Focus Ireland amendment, an all-party Focus Ireland amendment, to improve the legislation that you had brought? And unfortunately, you had watered down the Social Democrats' bill from a year earlier. So do you not remember all of that, Minister? Try and jog your memory, because I think you owe us an apology. Look, there is no doubt that the housing crisis is one of the main challenges facing the country, and the failure to address this crisis represents a major failure of responsibility on the part of you, Minister. Ensuring an adequate supply of housing at affordable cost is a basic responsibility of any government. But this minister has abdicated that responsibility by outsourcing it to the market. But the market is only concerned, of course, with the profit margin, and therefore takes no responsibility for the social and economic welfare of people. That, Minister, should be the job of politics. In relation to housing, the Minister talks a lot about supply, and while it's important to maintain a strong supply, the basic rules of supply and demand do not apply to housing. The reason for this is that the cost of land is the key determining factor when it comes to the cost of housing. While supply is obviously very important, but so too is affordability, and that is a reality which is ignored by this minister. We only have to recall what happened in the boom. There was an oversupply of housing, but critically, prices kept spiralling. More supply, in the absence of affordability, means that many people overextend themselves with borrowing, and we saw the awful consequences of that during the crash. If the minister was serious about the housing crisis, he would set out to drive down the cost of housing for both buyers and renters. But this and the last government set out to do the very opposite of that. And Minister Michael Noonan at the time, Minister for Finance, admitted as much. Government policies set out to bolster house prices rather than drive them down. The Help to Buy scheme is a case in point. So too is the new affordable scheme, both of which accept the inherent unaffordability of housing as a given and merely offer some discounting on these inflated prices. And so the root cause, the high land cost, is not tackled. It's quite clear that the balance sheets of the banks have been of much more concern to this government than ensuring people have homes. This minister is very fond of referring to the opposition's criticism as ideological. But this minister's heavy reliance on the private sector is entirely ideological. Fine Gael never see themselves as having any responsibility for the public good or for public provision. They see housing as a commodity to be bought and sold for profit, rather than an essential part of people's lives. Not only are they leaving housing to the market, but the policies which they are pursuing are clearly designed to maintain the high cost of housing. There are umpteen examples of this. The Minister, for example, refuses to adequately fund the local authorities and instead pours hundreds of millions of public money into the pockets of landlords through HAP. This in turn, of course, drives up rents. It means private renters have to compete with HAP tenancies. It also means that house buyers, especially first-time buyers, are squeezed out as they cannot compete with landlords. The recent practice of local authorities being encouraged to buy rather than build social housing also squeezes first-time buyers. And all of this, of course, conspires to keep house prices and rents high, while guaranteeing high returns for investors. Equally, the failure of this minister to tackle land hoarding in any kind of effective way means that people struggling to buy a home are at the mercy of developers who bought land at inflated prices during the boom and are now slowly releasing it in a way that maintains high land values. The site cost is now a major factor in high house prices, and this is a far greater factor than the cost of building. But I don't recall this minister ever identifying the high cost of land and the problem of land hoarding as any kind of factor in relation to the housing crisis, and I wonder why that's the case, Minister. The experience with Ó Cualann Housing Co-op in Ballymun has demonstrated how very good quality houses, carbon-neutral, three-bedroom houses, can be built for €200,000. There is no reason why we can't be building large numbers of houses at that price on the very many publicly owned sites available in Dublin and around the country. This is the kind of approach which was taken by many governments in the past, even when times were very hard. And it is a cruel irony that at a time when the country was never wealthier, that so many people are locked out of housing completely. There is now an entire generation of young people in their 20s and 30s who are denied the kind of human aspirations which their parents took for granted. To stay in this country, for example, to settle down, to consider starting a family, all due to the enormous struggle which faces them in trying to access decent housing. Of course, the cost of housing is the single greatest contributor to our high cost of living, and employers cite it as a significant issue in attracting people to come here to this country or return here to fill key job vacancies. And, of course, the lack of affordability has impacts beyond that generation, as their parents try to bail them out, try to support them financially, or try to accommodate them in an overcrowded home. But the tragedy is that it doesn't have to be like this. If the Minister was serious about ensuring people could have access to a decent home, he would ensure that we used public land for the public good. The Social Democrats have called for a housing delivery agency to develop well-planned mixed housing developments on all large public sites. This is the kind of sustainable and fair approach that is needed, and not the kind of land development agency proposed by the government, which would use public land to achieve private profit. It is clear that what the Minister has in mind for the LDA is not an agency which is socially focused, just as NAMA wasn't either, and claims by the Minister that he is implementing the Kenny report are just laughable. What is needed is for the state to take control of land prices and that the Minister should stop hiding behind the Constitution in that regard. Now, I want to say in conclusion then, having a place, last count Corlia, having a place to call home is a fundamental issue to us all as humans, and for that reason it is a fundamental responsibility of a housing minister to ensure everyone can have access to a home at a reasonable cost. You've utterly failed to do that, Minister. It's time to go. It's time for change. I commend this motion to the House.
Now,